Hello. I
Ah,
got to make sure I don't have myself muted. Welcome to the Storypath Q&A. Yeah, I was muting myself so that y'all couldn't hear our biting commentary behind the scenes while the pre-roll was running. And then I, didn't unmute myself for this, so that's great.
probably smart.
We're
Probably
super
smart.
professional. The other way around would be so much worse.
So,
If
yeah,
we
like,
muted
we
ourselves
just
now.
muted us during the panel. All you hear is us like talking shit to each other. Amazing.
Me and Matthew just going hammer and tongs about 4th edition D&D. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean,
I've
it
got
is the
nothing
best
against fourth
edition.
edition. Yeah, I've got
Neither do
nothing
I,
against
actually.
fourth edition
It's the
D&D.
best
I think
edition.
4th edition is great.
Let's talk about that for an hour.
No, we're here to talk
4th
about.
edition is really underrated.
It is. Don't get me started. Oh my God, don't get me started.
Okay.
We're not
we
here
here
to
for?
talk about fourth edition D&D. Now that we've disenfranchised half of our audience, what
Yeah.
are we here for?
We're here to talk about Storypath. So I'm sure you all know me, Eddy, and Matthew, but if not, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. Matthew, who are you and what do you have to do with Storypath?
Well, I'm the creative strategist at Onyx Path Publishing. What does that mean? Well, it means I set some of the creative direction at Onyx Path, but I also am the overseer, thus in-house developer of various games, including The World Below and the various They Came From lines, among others, which use Storypath, or in The World Below's case, Storypath Ultra, as their core system.
Oh, and Eddy, who are you and what do you have to do with Storypath?
My name is Eddy Webb. My pronouns are he, him. I am the executive producer at Onyx Path. And originally, I was actually kind of sort of the Storypath line developer for a minute. But then over time, we started moving Storypath into different directions. And so I kind of stepped away from that. But now, aside from Trinity stuff, I do kind of oversee Trinity. But then when we came back around, I've been helping you out with the direction for Ultra. Ultra.
Artra.
Ultra.
Utra. Utra. You're picking up that.
Outre.
You're picking up that Londoner accent.
Yes, that is the East London accent right there.
That is how East Londoners famously say the word ultra.
Yes.
Yeah.
Iche.
What about you,
quit.
Danielle? Who are you?
I am Danielle, or D, and I'm not anything special at Onyx Path. I'm just an in-house developer. So I don't have a fancy title like Matthew and Eddy do.
In-house developer's fancy enough, I think.
Is it?
Well, I think it's fancy enough
Wow.
for you, Danielle.
Wow, that's all I deserve.
Well, I mean, you have the fancy title of Storypath Ultra developer.
Yes, I do. I am the designer for Storypath Ultra, and I am the Storypath systems developer, which means that all of the Storypath books that get developed since I kind of got hired on come through me, and I get to play with all their mechanics and make sure they're all driving in the way that they should for the Storypath games. So that is my role and what I do for Storypath. So this is touted as a Q&A. So if you have questions about Storypath games, about Storypath itself, about Storypath Ultra, please ask them in the comments. I will try to get to them as we go. I do have
I'll keep track of them so you can focus on tech. So
Sure. We do want to talk a little bit about our Storypath games. A lot of our games at Onyx Path now are Storypath games, so we have a lot to talk about. But if you have any specific questions about Storypath or the Storypath games, please don't hesitate to ask. We may not be able to answer all of them because if you ask something very Scion specific or very Trinity specific, those should probably go in those specific panels. We'll be doing a Trinity Continuum panel in a few after this.
Hours?
Like in an hour and a half, essentially. After this panel, I've got a 30-minute break, and then I'm going right into another panel.
I'm going to bed.
Yeah, you're right. This is the start of my paneling. This is the end of your paneling.
Yeah. Welcome to multiple time zones.
Yes.
Hooray.
I wanted to throw in, Danielle,
Yeah.
that the way you say designer is very close to how the singer in Blink 182 sings the webs from all the spiders in the song
Are
I
you
Miss You.
are you saying that I sound nasally?
No, I'm wondering if you share a common cultural heritage.
I don't know. Where's Blink?
I don't know either. But for some reason, I've not thought of the song "I Miss You"
I
until
miss
you just said
you.
I'm a
I'm
designer.
so sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. What did, tell me, Blink 182,
Well,
where are you from?
yeah, so yeah, well,
I
we could do a Blink 182 sing along in this panel, although it'd probably be more wise to discuss Storypath.
Interesting.
Hey, yeah,
They're from Poway, California.
yeah.
Really?
I am from the other side of the US, completely
Well,
as polar opposite as you can get.
hmm
So, no, we do not share a similar cultural
it is just
background.
being nasal then.
Maybe I'm probably sounding a little bit more nasally today because my sinuses are kind of full of junk.
It's all that cocaine.
It is. Why can we don't need to talk about my cocaine habit here on the Storypath Q&A.
Oh, no shame.
Yeah.
So
I
back
know.
and forth is what I'm hearing.
I know no shame
ain't no
from you
shame
because you
with
spent so much
cocaine.
time with cokeheads in your other job duties in other places whose names I will not mention for propriety's sake.
Well, by the other companies I work for in the RPG industry.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I did work with one spilling tea where there was a cocaine thing, but I wasn't involved in that.
I
And
couldn't think of one
my lawyers have advised me to say that I was never there at the time when anything was being inhaled, exhaled, or otherwise rubbed into an orifice. Now let's talk about Storypath, because Storypath.
That is a hell of a transition, my friend. I can hear the gears grinding on that transition.
Nah, that's what I'm saying. My last.
But actually, I do want to. I've seen some questions really quick. I kind of want to jump
Thank
ahead of a trend I'm seeing to make sure to set expectations for this panel. One of the questions is, do we have a strategy how to implement Ultra in existing game lines? So we're not going to talk about that, right? We're not here to talk about what Ultra is going to look like for any current Storypath games, how they might look like in future, with the exception of they came from the RPG Anthology, which is on Kickstarter now. And if you're curious about how we're going to implement that, you should back Kickstarter right now and give us your support and money for that.
That's right.
In terms of what's it going to look like for Scion or Trinity or just Up Your Rising or whatnot, we're not going to talk about that because we're not there yet.
Right.
No.
So how will this apply to Scion? How will this apply to Trinity? We don't have answers to those questions. So just to kind of frame your expectations, we'll talk about how it's being used now in Trinity and Scion. We're happy to have those Q&A. But if it's all how is Ultra going to work on X game that we haven't announced yet, we can't tell you. We don't know.
Yeah.
And we're not just being like, we're not going to tell you. We literally don't know. We haven't started working on that yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is it's a mental exercise. Certainly, we would certainly at some point start considering ultrafying various games, but so that isn't what we're working on right now. What we can talk about, as mentioned, Storypath Ultra does show up in They Came from the RPG Anthology, and if you do back it on Kickstarter, you will get full access to that chapter, so you can find out everything that Storypath Ultra contains from a They Came From vein. Similarly, if that isn't for you, and it should be, you can download the Storypath Ultra brochure, which we released along with the opening ceremonies of this convention. So you'll be able to pick it up and read it that way. This is a more generic take on it. Now, one of the things that we have done, well, I think Storypath Ultra neatly refines an awful lot of the, I guess, more open-ended systems of Storypath that existed in its initial iteration. Ultra isn't, I don't think, what anyone would consider a brand new edition of Storypath. It is a refinement.
Yep.
This is why we're not calling it Storypath 2 or anything like that. It is a system that, by its nature, can very easily be applied to existing games that have Storypath as the system, because the changes are largely along the line of streamlining rather than, and here's a bunch of brand new rules that we've just plucked out of thin air.
Right.
So you will find some terminology changes, and there will be, and I know it was discussed on the Onyx Path forum, some skill changes, for instance. But those skill changes, as an example, aren't like for like. They are based on things like what skills have we found people using, or what skills make the most sense for our Storypath games. We want our games to be using the same set of skills, and anyone who knows a lot of our games will know that, for instance, Scion and Trinity had different skill lists. So it became an opportunity to consolidate that and make it make sense across the Storypath line. So that's just a little bit of spiel from me while I'm waiting for all the questions to roll in.
And oh, go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, I was just going to say, while questions are rolling in, which we will get to, one of the things I did want to say is I know that there's going to be a lot of questions about Storypath Ultra, and we will try to answer them to the best of our ability in a way that makes sense without, we're not going to make any promises here.
Right. Yeah. In case you folks here were not in our WhatsApp panel, another piece of context to help for some of this discussion is that it's already been linked in the chat, but we do have a Storypath Ultra preview brochure that was released yesterday. And there gives you a 16-page quick summary of what Storypath Ultra is going to look like. It does have quick conversion rules for how to use it in Trinity, Scion, and some of our other existing Storypath games they came from and whatnot. So again, if the how will this look in blah, most of the answers are probably there. And if it isn't there, it goes back into the we don't know if it looks like yet bucket. But also we've announced that we're going to be doing the Storypath Ultra Core Manual. And that is a book where we're actually presenting the system without a wrapper of a setting to go with it, which we've never done as a company before. But if you're familiar with things like the Cortex Manual or Savage Worlds or Fate, or where Genesis. They present the system in a whole... Genesis. Games where they give you the system and then a lot of contextualized advice on how to use the system. That is more what we're going for. And again, we're still at the outline stage for that, so I can't go into specifics of what's going to be in that book because we're still working that out. But so if you're just saying Storypath Ultra in questions, I'm assuming you're referring to Storypath Ultra Core Manual. So if you actually have questions about things like the world below, then you should clarify you're talking about the world below. If you have questions about they came from the RPG anthology, clarify we're talking about that game. That will help us in our discussion going forward.
So it does look like we've got a couple of questions that we can...
I'm queued up here if you want to go through them.
Sure. Go ahead and give us the first question.
Sure. And I'm betting the ones that are some form of stuff we covered earlier. Will Storypath Ultra have Roll20 or VTT support in the coming months? I want to put the timing question, which it seems like every panel we talk about this, but we don't give timings. Because there's so many things that can go wrong between now and then, so I don't want to say it's going to be out by this time and not be. And also, a lot of the games that are using Storypath Ultra right now are still in the process of being made. We would love to have VTT support. We are looking at a lot of options for VTT platforms for all of our games, including our Storypath games. So the answer is yes, at some point. But what that support looks like and specifics of it, we don't have the answers for.
Right. Yeah. That's the best we can say for that.
Okay. This one is a little more, I think, that Danielle and Matthew can answer. Will Storypath Ultra present some form of spellcasting system? And I think we're talking about, this is why I mentioned earlier, I can't answer that question about the Storypath Core Manual, but how does that look in the world below?
Okay, so this is an interesting question because spellcasting, well, it still works within the fundamentals of Storypath Ultra. as it appears in the world below. You are not expected to come up with any new traits. That it is basically all formed from the same system. And that, I would suggest, is a system that is likely to see variation across games depending on what we want: spells or magic or tricks or whatever well, not tricks, that's a different thing. Boons, knacks, whatever. What we want them to convey. Sometimes we want a spell to be the result of a dice pool roll. Sometimes we want it to be an immediate effect that someone has to roll to resist. And that often comes down to questions like, do we want magic to be all-powerful, or do we want it to be low-level and mysterious? So it's a really interesting question to land on, because different games obviously approach magic in different ways, and even when using the same system, they often I guess, contextualize it differently within that system. We will be doing the same thing within Storypath Ultra, almost certainly, because magic and special powers are such an important part of any role-playing game where they're present, and one size fits all doesn't always do the job.
No.
Quite frankly.
Right.
Yeah, one of the things I will say is that, when you think about spell casting system, I know, you followed up with, you want to play Scarred Lands using Storypath, and which of the games would you hack to do that? And unfortunately, at the moment, I don't think any of the spellcasting systems that we have for Storypath Ultra, they came from, or the world below, would really be great for that. Just because contextually the magic system of a game is kind of like the how the powers manifest based on the setting. And we do that a lot in our games, where we make the mechanics of what powers you have and what you're doing and what you're capable of doing really fit with the setting and evoking the right feel for the game. So in Scion, spellcasting is miracles and boons. In Trinity, spellcasting is gifts and or quantum powers or psi powers. So these things are very intrinsic to the setting itself. I will say that I know that we are going to be adding some example subsystems in the Storypath Ultra core book. Those have not been written yet.
Yep.
So I can't tell you what they're going to be, but I do believe that presenting a generic, here's how you would build a magic system from ground up, is a good idea. So we may look at putting that in there.
Right. We have a fair bit of they came from questions.
Wow, okay, let's test my mechanical knowledge.
Right. First one is they came from bonds are rated from 1 to 5 intensity, but there seems to be any mechanical change between having 1 or 5. So,
well, each level of the bond gives an additional enhancement. If that isn't clear, I'll definitely make it so by the finished manuscript. The key thing when it comes to bonds and their intensity granting enhancement is bond enhancement is also used for overcoming advantage or bringing advantage down at a rate, if I recall, of 2 per 1 level of advantage, essentially. So it isn't like you can just team up with 4 people who are your mates and all of a sudden you are bringing a god down to human level. There is still an advantage differential, but it's a fairly easy one to calculate, I would suggest. So yeah, the idea is each level grants you an enhancement. So there you go.
Next question is, according to They Came From Rules, teamwork is managed by adding the pools together, but you don't change difficulty. So how do you ensure challenge even on rules where players are working together?
Well,
I think the answer is you don't.
There's a couple of answers. One is, the point of teamwork is to basically cut difficulty down, not numerically, but you essentially add more dice to the pool. But one thing that if you want, as a story guide, you can do to change all this is basically ensure everyone has to roll the same pool. That basically means that you're likely to play with some weaker characters. But for the most part, and the way we presented it, I agree that if everyone, for instance, is making an artistry-based roll, then you are all pitching in to essentially, let's say, analyze the secret of this painting. Is this an original or is it a forgery? Well, everyone gets to pitch in on that because everyone is sharing their expertise on it. And so, yeah, it just means you add more dice. And if the difficulty is 2, then you just need 2 hits to overcome that difficulty.
Right. I have a question for Danielle. Is your cat imposing a complication or a difficulty increase right now?
It's, I think, a little bit of both. I definitely have a complication. If I successfully talk to y'all, and I don't buy off that complication, I could get razored in the neck.
That seems pretty accurate.
Yeah.
So back to the game from. And now we're going into some brochure questions. So we're going to move into the area of not everything. The brochure is meant to be a preview. It's not going to have absolutely everything in it. You may not get some full answers. But the game from includes the rule tricks costing 2 hits add an additional full action to the character's initial action. However, the latest brochure includes rules for mixed action as presented in Scion. Will the final Storypath rules be using mixed actions or rules be changing into a trick? I'm not entirely sure I understand that question.
So I do.
Okay, thank you.
So the base Storypath rules have some generic tricks that you can do. And one of the example tricks is that, or the way that tricks are described is that for 1 hit, you get kind of a rider on your current action. For 2 hits, it's probably going to add an additional action to what you're doing. And then for 3 hits, it's going to be some kind of like show-stopping ability. So mixed actions still exist, as you know, you could still do 2 things at once, and you're still going to roll similarly to how you do in the base Storypath system. Sorry, my nose is just like running. But the reason that that's stated that way is because your tricks are going to, if you are making your own tricks, that is kind of the guidelines for how to cost those tricks.
Right. Okay. So that's advice, not ironclad.
Yeah.
Wow, this is a mechanical test panel, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, it really is. It is
an exam.
And a reminder is that I'm treating chat questions, but please, you need to preface with the word question if at all possible, because it is hard to lose it in the chat. Next one is about staged actions. Are they resolved in 1 roll now? And how do things work with things like investigations or chases?
That will depend on the game. Staged actions will... so the brochure doesn't say anything about them because the brochure doesn't say anything about game-specific subsystems and how you do staged actions or whether or not you even need staged actions will be game independent.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I was going to say one of the reasons why we took Ultra the way we did is that we're not making a system that applies to every game. I think we're never going to make that game because we realized even with original Storypath that each game needs to be adjusted, like you mentioned earlier with spellcasting, each game needs to be adjusted to best represent the experience that game is trying to emulate and present. The difference with Ultra is that rather than taking a core system and modifying it to fit the game, we're making sure that the ground rules are the same, and then what we build on top of those may be different. So the idea of the brochure is that those are the ground rules we're going to present for all of our Ultra games, but if it's definitely not mentioned there, that means that each game can start to make choices based on that.
Right.
Yeah. So staged actions to go back to that point. Well, and this is the same with a lot of Storypath Ultra. The way it's presented as an example in they came from Appendix for the RPG anthology and the World Below. Is that staged actions are essentially immediate at the table, but that doesn't mean your characters are resolving these things immediately. Staged actions involve characters making different rolls of different skills because they're all throwing their own expertise into overcoming a problem. In a movie, this would be a montage. In our games, this is a dice roll. One thing that we have found time and time again across many of the games that we have developed is things like extended actions where you've got to keep going back round to the person at the table and saying, now roll, see how you're doing 5 minutes later or an hour later. Is that that ends up draining fun. And it's a lot easier to do the roll, see whether it's successful, and also staged actions I would say fairly generous because you only need half or more of the characters to be successful in order to resolve whether it's a success, and then you move on with the plot. What I would advise is don't mistake the amount of time it takes for the players to roll the dice for the amount of time it takes for the characters to complete the task. Part of that's got to come through the role play, but also it's going to come through the story guide or director actually telling the story, narrating the scene. Congratulations, you have now built a rope bridge that spans the chasm, but that doesn't happen in 3 seconds. That's probably a 45-minute action that you don't have to play through in exacting detail.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No.
Next question is pretty straightforward. The brochure says that players can spend momentum to purchase evidence. Is that 1-for-1 basis? Yes, 1 momentum buys 1 evidence. And those were clues, not core clues. Core clues are now leads, and those are still free. So this is additional clues on top of that. We just now call that evidence. And basically, it's a way to, when you're in investigation, I have some extra hits. It's a way to spend those hits to get extra cool stuff. That's really what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to reframe this question a little bit, but we talked about integrity as a concept in the brochure, and someone's asking, does that mean that integrity is no longer a skill on the list?
Yes. So integrity is now like defense, but it is your social defense.
Yeah.
Right.
So it is just the word for defending against social influence actions. So I can go a little bit into the reasoning for this is that social influence actions always felt a little weird to me in Trinity Court. You set a difficulty kind of based on an attitude plus a bond plus like some other stuff, and like it made it feel a little weird. And also I was always unsure like what is my difficulty for trying to do a social influence action against this random guard I just met.
Right.
And now we use integrity. Okay, so it's going to be just like defense. It's just like attacking the guard.
Yep.
So that is the point of doing that. And integrity as a skill always felt like a little like it was trying to do that. So we just pulled it out and said, hey, well, this is what integrity is now.
Yeah, it's a funny thing that comes up in a few different games. I don't know whether I'd consider it a ubiquitous skill. It's in the way we presented it in Storypath Classic. It's a defensive skill first and foremost, which is difficult to role play. One could say, but it could also act. It could act as a dump stat because it is a part of your sheet and therefore a part of your character. One would assume everyone has some level of integrity, and so in Storypath Ultra they do.
Right.
But But you come across that kind of refinement in an awful lot of role-playing games. It's when we examine when Chaosium examine in a game like Call of Cthulhu, or the variants on Call of Cthulhu. So how are they approaching library use and spot hidden when it comes up so often? Or in World of Darkness, perception. Perception is the sort of mental attribute that's getting paired with every damn thing. So let's make it a different combination, because everyone just keeps putting their dots in perception and no one's putting them in appearance. So the reverse occurs there. So that kind of refinement of what skills actually have a place on the sheet and in the game, it's a really good question. And it's the kind of thing that as games designers, we have to really think about. Because when you approach a new edition, or when you approach a refined rule set, you need to look at every single one of these things and think, does it serve the purpose it was built for? Or is there a more elegant way of getting to the same conclusion? And in this case, integrity as your mental defense essentially makes a lot more sense than having it be a stat that's rated 0 to 5 for us.
Yeah. I'm actually going to pull. I'm switching briefly to the Discord, because there's an ongoing conversation there that I think is relevant for us to kind of talk about here.
What? The Discord?
I know. I'm pulling from the forbidden space.
Yes. Hey, the Discord phone's going up.
But I know
Batman.
I know it's the conversation Danielle and I had actually when we were talking about Ultra initially. So it might be worth kind of going through our logic for it. But we decided to go with the enhancement doesn't stack option for Ultra. So maybe Daniel can talk about why we made that decision.
Sorry, I was looking at the Discord whenever you asked that question. Say it again.
Oh, fair enough. Basically, I mean, there wasn't a specific question, but rather some people talking about specifically how in the brochure enhancement no longer stacks.
Yes.
It's now the highest enhancement. And so I thought it was worth maybe kind of talking through what our logic was for making that decision.
Yeah. So one of the things that Trinity Continuum does is it allows you to stack enhancement, stack enhancement, stack enhancement, so you can get a bunch of enhancement. But one of the things that we have decided to do is reduce all of our numbers everywhere, which also means we're reducing numbers on antagonist side as well. So when you're, and on difficulty. So if, the standard difficulty in Storypath Ultra is 1. If you want a difficulty increase from a power, it's only going to increase that difficulty by 1. If something increases the difficulty by 2 or 3, that is very, very potent. So we wanted to have our hits be a much more condensed space. When we're going to do that, then we need our enhancement to also scale back. So now, if things are adding enhancement, it's going to add 1 or 2 enhancement, maybe 3. But if you're getting 3 enhancement from one thing, I really don't think you should also be getting additional enhancement from something else, because now your rolls are going to be way higher than the difficulties and the complications. We also scaled back complications. Now complications are 1, 2, or 3. They don't go up to 4 or 5 unless something is breaking that rule because it's a special power somewhere. So all of it is in service to making the numbers much tighter.
Yeah, in Trinity, for example, it's really easy to get enhancement, but that's the point of Trinity. You're supposed to be talent, and if you're relatively good at your job and relatively planned for your job, you should succeed more often than not. And by more often not means pretty frequently. But the numbers are scaled in that way to make sure to account for those additive enhancement. So if we scale everything back, then we have to also scale enhancement back to make sure that it's hitting just the right amount and make sure it's comfortably useful, but not overbearing. Because if you could add 5, 6 enhancement together and your core difficulty is 1, then you're doing nothing but buying tricks constantly. So make sure there's some challenge in there and making sure dice rolls still have some meaning to it while still shooting for a relatively competent result.
Yes.
That leads me to one of the questions, which was that enhancement gained from spent momentum, is that subject to the enhancements not stack rule? And I think the answer is no.
Yes. It does not. And that might be something that we need to clarify in our books. So it's a great question, actually.
Yeah.
But if you are spending momentum from to gain enhancement on a roll, it is not subject to that stacking rule.
Right. And someone, again, in Discord has clarified that when we say enhancement stack, that does with the caveat of unless otherwise specified.
Yeah.
And there's those cases that maybe we need to make sure we specify that.
Yes. Yeah, because some powers may let you stack enhancement, and that is a bit like a special thing.
Right. Right, as opposed to that being the default.
Right.
The question is, how do extended actions work? I think we covered that already a little bit, didn't we?
We talked about staged actions and we talked about extended actions, but I think people are trying to figure out essentially like how is a chase going to work? How is a investigation going to work? And the answer now is instead of having a full out system for saying like, oh, this is an extended action, every roll is 5 minutes of time, and if you don't hit this difficulty by the end of all these things, then you don't succeed. Instead, we want all of those things, chases, investigations, even crafting, to feel more in the moment and hands-on.
Yeah.
So if you're doing a chase scene, then every action you take is a new action. And if it is something that your character, if you're trying to outrace, somebody else, it's just an opposed roll. And then every time, until they catch up or they don't, or you lose them or whatever, it's not really an extended action anymore, because we felt that the only place that extended actions really have a place is with crafting. And crafting is now going to be extremely game dependent on how crafting works.
Yeah. I mean, the Trinity Continuum Player's Guide, which of course we did crowdfunding on not that long ago, has a wonderful chase system in it. It's a lovely refinement of Storypath Classic that enables that as a dramatic chase with dice rolls. Just to reiterate my point from earlier, the thing we want to get away from is the lack of roleplay. Extended actions have a real risk of becoming dice rolling exercises. Now, they can be fun in the hands of the right story guide or players. You can all be watching each other's dice closely and thinking, oh, I hope you succeed on this one. That tension can build. But as a framework, quite often those systems are dry. You need to get a certain number of hits or a certain number of successes, depending on your iteration of Storypath. And you kind of come out of the moment at that point and you're just trying to get to the conclusion. This used to be the case a lot with investigations. I know there's evidence here. I've got to roll this many hits. So basically my character is out of action until I have got this many hits. That's not much fun for the most players. Some players may love it. Many don't. So we want to put the narrative action, the drama, the role play back into these things. And ultimately this is all echoing what Danielle says, but we want this game to be fun. We want these games to be fun, and I feel like Storypath Ultra's almost core objective is to put fun into the system. It's something we often just my last point.
Sure, go ahead.
Stop wittering. We often cite one of our mentors, friends, colleagues, Rose Bailey, and the way Rose makes systems. The way she makes systems feel interactive and part of play. And it's a wonderful thing to strive for. It's something we always try to strive for. And not
We can only be so lucky. That's the special.
Bailey is one Rose Bailey. Yes, absolutely.
That's all right. That's all right.
Yeah.
0.8 isn't too bad.
No. No one else could be a Rose Bailey except for Rose Bailey, but everyone else is point something Rose Baileys.
Oh, apparently people. Yes.
Yeah, it's my fault. I accidentally hit the mute button for y'all.
Right. All you missed is us comparing what percentage points of Rose Baileys we all are. So, and the answer is none of us are one Rose Bailey.
No, it's like
apparently we are still muted according to the commentary.
Yeah, no, we're back. Yeah.
Yeah, we're back.
Yeah, they're back.
Yeah, that person might have a little bit slower internet, but
Yep. There we go. Yep.
Good.
We are no longer all muted.
Ooh,
I checked the tech. Yes, I was trying to hit shift and I accidentally hit control.
Yeah.
And it fucked everything up. I'm so sorry.
Classic mistake.
Let's start the panel again.
All right, welcome to the story.
What? No, that's tomorrow.
The Onyx Pathcast is tomorrow, so.
Yes.
Yeah.
A couple more questions to get through, and then we can go on to. Actually, no. There was something else I was going to say. I wouldn't react for. This is not a new edition, right?
Yep.
I mean, we're talking about, we think that this game makes it more fun, make it more fluid, whatnot. Those are not meant to be pejorative. Those are a different flavor of system. So if you like the dice rolling, and if that's something you do find fun at your table, and you do want mixed actions, or if you do want extended actions, they're still there. Those games are still there. They're not going away. So you can still play those, and we're never going to take those away from you. And in fact, we do want you to actually take the pieces of Storypath that you want. Like I've seen some people already who are like, oh, I love this thing from the brochure, so using it in my Scion games.
Yeah, absolutely do.
Please do that. The flip side is that there are some people when the World Below comes out and goes, you know what, I really prefer the injury conditions rather than what you're doing with injuries now or health now, then great. Drop that in.
Yep.
That's something that we want people to see do. Mix and match between them because they're not meant to be. They're not binary. You must use one or the other. We're just going to start presenting games in Ultra going forward because we like how that game refinement is working. But we also are very proud of the work we've done in the original Storypath system, and that's not going away.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's like, we can reiterate that Storypath Ultra is, it's like Fate Accelerated, or I can't actually think of another really good example, but it is.
They're all awful.
Well, there's Savage Worlds and Savage Worlds Adventures edition.
Right. So it's an edition of Storypath that you could pick and choose parts of it and put it into Storypath Classic, and it would work just fine because it's not a new edition. It's still got the same DNA. It's still got the same bones. They, really only took parts of it, and like we changed some names and we slapped some new paint on it and said look at this Ultra thing that we made. But it is very similar still to Storypath Classic.
It's a lot of representing stuff that was already there.
Right. And reimagining stuff that I could talk all day about complication, and I have talked in the past about how I envision complication working in Storypath is that if, one, you should only be rolling when there's something interesting that's going to happen if you fail to roll or if you fail to succeed. And complications should show up often on those actions because even success should drive the story forward. And so it's not that complications are this extra oh, haha, I'm getting at you, I'm the story guide, and I'm going to trick you into having something bad happen even though you wanted to take this action. It is instead the difficulty's 1. It's super easy to hit the difficulty. But by taking this action, here is this unintended consequence you may cause, and therefore you need to, that's where the extra you need extra hits to overcome that. And so really it's kind of I wanted to see a fail forward system that people could take or leave if they wanted to, because we still have very strong traditional game DNA. And so I want people, if they don't like that concept, they don't have to use it. But I really wanted complications to be part of the DNA of the game, in that here we are doing this thing, and, you know, you succeeded, but at what cost? You succeeded, but at what cost? Every time you're taking an action that needs a roll. And so that still exists in Storypath Classic. That is how Storypath Classic works, but it's not as forward as I'd like it to be. So, so we reimagined, how do we explain this to people?
Yeah. And I mean, a small thing, for example, is just little things like calling successes hits.
Yep.
Was because one thing that when we were digging in, we realized that we were using success two different ways.
Yep.
Success is how many things you generate your dice roll, and then also whether you succeed your roll or not, and realized that that led to some clunky conversations, at least. So by changing that language, again, they work the same, but it allows us to make that clear. Same with moving scale to advantage. It generally works the same way, but some people were hung up on scale as a concept that can be measured, and it's okay, we need to move away from that concept to get to what we actually always wanted scale to be, which is about just, this guy's better than that guy, so here's some extra bonuses that moves in this particular arena.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's been a couple of extra questions that I think we can answer.
I think we already touched on this one, which is, what is your favorite change in Scion Ultra? Or Storypath Ultra? I think it's actually what it means. It says Scion Ultra, but I think it means Storypath Ultra.
Actually, my favorite change in Storypath Ultra is advantage.
That was going to be my answer, but that's good.
Because now I honestly wrote that to try to never have to talk about scale again.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I did like how we have changed bonds, because I always felt bonds was one of the neat little bits of Storypath that don't seem to get used very often and doesn't get talked about very often. And the only game that I can know of that really dug into that was when they used it for Dystopia Rising Evolution. And it was one of those things that once I explained it to people, every time people were like, oh my God, that's amazing. But it never really quite got off the page in a way I think any of us liked. And so being able to kind of pull that out more and make it a bigger, more integral part of the system, and also clarifying negative and positive bonds more, I think really helps to sell that. No, like, you get dice if you go save your wife, you know?
Yep.
I feel the same, and it may be my favorite part of Ultra, about status effects. I think, again, and I see you be posting in the chat, Danielle, and it's a similar thing here. It is a question of psychology. It's and terminology. I think people understand what status effects are based on video games, and whereas conditions, while fundamentally the same kind of thing, doesn't have the same, I guess. Ironically,
condition feels more permanent and negative. It's like you have a condition, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, an awful lot of status effects are negative, and I don't think any of them are permanent. Right. But yeah, I just really like the way status effects come across. And what's more, and this is the funny thing, just to show that it isn't just a reader perception thing. As a writer, I find the idea of status effects easier to write than I do conditions.
Even though they're exactly the same thing.
Even though they're exactly the same, it's a mental block.
Yep. Another World Below question for Matthew, or both of you, I suppose. Since they have tiered powers, what's kind of the design logic behind the tiers?
Design logic behind the tiers of sorceries in the World Below is a very simple one, and it is simply that as the World Below is a fantasy game in a certain mold, we want it to feel familiar to people who play things like D&D, Pathfinder, RuneQuest, and such, that there are certain powers that are more potent than others, and you cannot access them without either investing more of yourself or reaching a certain power level. So mechanically speaking, they work in the same way as powers at any other tier. But yeah, I guess the design theory, it does come in from the I guess archetypal fantasy idea of a magic missile is a lower tier spell than chain lightning, as an
Right.
example, despite the fact both of them are intended to kill or do damage to the opponent. Now, the interesting thing about it is because we still adhere to some of the, I guess, point buy principles of games like Trinity and Scion in the world below, you can, in theory, start off a character with a level 3 sorcery. You can start off with a big, bad spell that you can go casting. It just means you've got less access to the lower tier ones when you start. And that hopefully tells a story about your character. It doesn't limit you, it makes you the person the community goes to do this thing, because so few people have access to this power. And it may be a weird power, it may be something no one else trusts themselves with, but you are the person who speaks to plants, or you're the person that can create tremors that open up new caves. So yeah, if you invest them, great, your character is a specialist in a particularly esoteric kind of sorcery. It may be very powerful, but yeah, it just means you are investing in that power at the expense of some of your prestidigitation style, simple sorcery tricks.
Absolutely. Another question. I'm going to kind of rephrase a little bit because I think it's more interesting if we talk about it in a broader sense. But we mentioned that paths have specialties, and kind of what does that look like?
Yeah. So specialties were a little weird in Storypath Classic, in my opinion. Other people might have just house ruled them to work the way they read like they should work, but the way they are written to work is if you are good at close combat, right? I'm a martial artist, I'm good at close combat, I have 3 or higher in in that skill. I have a specialty in karate. Okay. I have a specialty in karate. So anything that would require a specialty in karate to take the action for. So if somebody told me that, like, oh, I want to do this kick flip, and it's like, well, if you have karate, like, that's never going to come up. But if it did, like, that would be then oh, I need that specialty to do that thing. Okay. The other way it worked is if I'm rolling a different skill, and I say, would my knowledge of karate, my specialty in karate, aid me in what I am doing right now? I think it would. It would add enhancement to that action. Now, it doesn't make my close combat any better, but it makes all my other skills, when dealing with that, like, purview of specialty, makes them better. And on paper, that sounds really cool. In practice, trying to figure out when my specialties apply is a bear. So instead, what we did is, it's only one of your paths is going to have a specialty, essentially, depending on the game, which path it is, but generally it's your role path. And anything you do that could be covered by the fact that you are that role gets that enhancement. So now it applies to all your skills, all your
so your role would be martial artist or whatever.
So my role would be martial artist, and now my close combat attacks, I'm doing a martial arts move, it gets an enhancement. I'm giving a talk about martial arts, it gets that enhancement. I need to use nunchucks, I can, because I am a martial artist. That is part of it's part and parcel. We also will not have things that require special training based on a specialty, but instead based on a path.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the basic way to answer that.
And again, it goes to the point where on paper, the intent was always that your paths allow you to do things, and they're always meant to be kind of an ongoing thing. So the idea is, like you said, my role path is, say my origin is military brat, and I'm trying to investigate someone who's been in the military. Well, okay, you have the military brat origin, so I'll give you extra enhancement for doing it. It's meant to be kind of an ad hoc at the table thing, but I think it never really happens. Roles only really matter to character creation and kind of stopped mattering after that.
Right.
And so that's another piece of it, is repackaging the stuff, representing it, making it a little clearer that paths are an ongoing part of your character sheet, not just something you use at character creation.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like we have any new questions, which is good because we're coming up on time. We only have about 5 more minutes. So
Did we drive them all off?
I don't think so. I think we're just doing a good job of answering questions, Matthew.
Well, that's wonderful. Excellent. I mean, I'd like to say that I noticed. So I have been very seldom exposed to specialties as they were presented in Storypath Classic because they didn't have them.
Right.
It was one of those system differences we had. We had trademarks, and they came from which acted kind of like, I guess, specialties in storytelling gone by.
Yeah.
Where you affix them to a skill, except it isn't a specialized skill, it is a narrative specialty. So you come up with a phrase like hits like a truck, and that is your trademark, and you affix that to close combat or what have you. But yeah, I do like the way Ultra does it, that it attaches it to a path, and I need to review how that's being used in the world below. That's the thing. We need to there's a certain modular aspect to Storypath Ultra. Ultra is a complete system. We've mentioned, there are various knobs and widgets, gadgets that we may want to look at, things like crafting, things like chase rules, things that are highly specific to different games, just like sorceries are specific to the world below. But at its, I guess, fundamental core, it should be reflected across the various games that use Storypath Ultra. You should be able to go from one game to the next without confusion.
Right, the fundamentals should work the same across the games, even if the nuanced subsystems on top of it differ.
Exactly.
Right. We've had, as usual, these space panels, we've had a lot of questions at the last minute. So Danielle, I will turn over to you to see which ones of those you want to answer, because it seems it's all pretty mechanical.
Yeah, so it looks like most of the questions are about enhancement and past specialties. So invoking a path, that is a scion concept, and in the sense of like you invoke a path to get a bonus, and so that is not necessarily going to be carried over into Storypath Ultra. That is,
but again, we don't know what's going to look like if we do any version of that with Ultra.
Right. But past specialties are, you don't invoke the path, you don't have any, you don't have to do anything special to get that bonus. Somebody asked about, with enhancement not stacking, will those bonuses disappear? Where so your specialties don't matter because you always have enhancement coming from somewhere else. And I will say that enhancement is also kind of handed out a little less in Storypath Ultra. So you're not going to necessarily be able to pull enhancement for literally every action you take from a piece. You may have a specialized piece of gear, you may have a specialized ability that is giving you enhancement to the things that you're really good at or the things that you've invested in. But most of your actions will not have just a base enhancement added to them. So this is where your specialty of your path will allow you to be more broadly competent in places that you haven't spent a bunch of, for lack of a better term, a lot of investment making yourself really good at.
Right. A good example actually is I ran Trinity Continuing Anima at UK Games Expo, and Matthew's character was a social character, and I gave him enhancement +1 for wearing a sharp suit, because in Trinity that's the goal. Like the whole point of design of Trinity is like you did a cool thing. Here's an enhancement for this. Here's an enhancement for that. And going to Ultra, that's the kind of thing that Matthew would go. My role is I am a social character, so when I invoke that, especially to get that enhancement that way. So it's, again, exact same concept, packaged differently to get to the same place, but then it's less on the story guide to keep generating, oh, you get enhancement for this, you get enhancement for that. More the player to start pointing parts of the character sheet and going, I get enhancement for this, I get enhancement for that.
Right.
And I should say that that is exactly how I role play. When the story guide comes to me, I look at them and I say, my role is this. And I point at my character sheet and say, so I get enhancement for that. And I just, wait, now
I demand enhancement for that.
I demand.
No. It's already there. I mean, it's on the sheet. I wouldn't have noted down sharp suit if I wasn't expecting to get an enhancement from it, dick. Is what I say to story guides. It's why I'm not welcome at most players' tables.
It's true.
But I have a code, and I feel it's important to live by it. You'll find out more about this code if you vote for They Came from the Code of Bushido in the They Came from RPG Anthology poll launching this Monday, which will be all of our runners-up.
Right.
I'm just going to mute you real quick. No, I'm just kidding.
Right, yeah.
I have a very different idea of what the Bushido code is. It's just going up to people and saying, I'm going to do what I want, dick.
Yeah. Okay.
That's not at all how that works, but okay.
All right. We are coming up on time. In fact, we're at a minute, but there's nothing after this for another 30 minutes. So I'm really just eating to my own break time. So
yeah, I want to order food. So.
Too bad. So there is something that I didn't get a chance to talk about on this panel that I will probably drop in the Storypath Ultra Discord channel that has been made very recently.
Beautifully set up.
Diligently by Ian. Thank you, Ian. So yeah, we if you have any more questions about Storypath Ultra, we may be able to get to them in the Discord, but please feel free to ask questions, theorize, just don't state anything as I figured this out and it is fact, because you could be wrong.
No,
and we don't have a whole lot of facts out there right now, so.
Right. The only people who can say anything with facts is us, and we're not that reliable right now.
And things change. That's the thing. Where things do change. Like we are releasing The World Below in an Ashcan version very soon.
Yes.
This is going to be one of our first points of exposure when it comes to Storypath Ultra. It's a condensed version. It's not going to be the full thing, but we will be releasing it, and it's a playtest document for all intents and purposes. The feedback from that will be invaluable. So if you pick up the World Below Ashcan version when it's released, let us know what you think. Let us know what works for you and what doesn't work for you. The worst we can do is ignore you or tell you to shut up. Yeah. But that's not going to happen. We'll say thank you very much for your feedback. It's treasured.
Matthew will absolutely tell you to shut up to himself, and then he'll type "Thank you for your feedback"
and post a
thank you for your feedback.
I'll post a big passive-aggressive smiley face afterwards, just to show you how pleased I am.
All right. So if I'm not going to do that thing that we were like, if somebody can find you, I think you know where you can find us.
I did want to say, though, real quick, is that since some people have mentioned Scarlands in passing, if you are interested in our fantasy game derivations, the Storypath Ultra is not the only game system that Onyx Path owns. Tomorrow at 1:30 p.m., we're going to have an Onyx 20 Q&A where I talk about Pugmire and potential of future games being derived from the Pugmire system that we're now calling Onyx 20. So I'm not saying we're going to do Scarlands in Storypath Ultra or Onyx 20. We're still debating that, but the point is that if you have different system questions, that is another option to talk about this weekend.
All right.
And I have a lot more to say as opposed to this panel where I didn't have much to say. Between the questions, I'm like, I don't know what to say.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, that is us then. So I'm gonna try to do this properly. But thank you all for our questions and for engaging, and we will see you all later. Oh, before I go, I am going to be doing an actual play of a Storypath Ultra tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern. I will tell you, I have decided to run based on Rich's conversations about urban fantasy, an urban fantasy scenario using different monsters as the character types. So if you are interested in seeing what that might look like in Storypath Ultra, because I have ideas of what that might look like, I've made some shit up, you're welcome to come and watch. Tell all your friends.
And also watching Klaus losing his damn mind in the background for some reason.
I hard to know. All right. With that, we'll see you later.
Bye-bye.